Born and raised on the island of Oahu, Noelani Jones, meaning heavenly mist, is a community-building fiber artist, passionate about strengthening communities and individuals with art and an appreciation for the natural world. She graduated from Virginia Commonwealth University School of Arts in 2017 with her BFA in Craft and Material Studies with a concentration in fibers. Jones has attended Penland School of Craft and John C. Campbell Folk School in North Carolina and Marshfield School of Weaving in Vermont. Her work has been exhibited at galleries, museums in Virginia, North Carolina, Maryland, Chicago, and many other alternative DIY spaces throughout the United States. Additionally, Jones is the recipient of a 2024 Artist Development Grant from the Vermont Arts Council. She's been an artist in residence at the Anne Marie Sculpture Garden in Maryland, Vermont Studio Center, and most recently, North Branch Nature Center in Mount Pillier, Vermont. Would you welcome Noelani Jones? You should just be with an arrow.
Okay, great. It's not gonna play or anything? Perfect. All right, awesome. Thank you for that introduction, Corey. That was very detailed of all my experiences I've had. Thank you all for coming to my Art at Noon talk about my show, Time is a Place. Did anybody see the show in January, February? Awesome, perfect. It's okay if you didn't. I'm gonna talk about it, but I just wanted to know. Awesome, I guess I'll go ahead and dive on in. So as Corey said, Time is a Place was a show that I had on the second floor here at the Delaplane. This is me in front of it. It was basically, the whole show was hand woven and also natural dye. And it was a lot about the time that it takes to weave and the time that it takes to grow the fiber, as well as the plants, also the time that it takes to dye. So I was working toward this show, Time is a Place, for maybe about a year before I came here to show it. It was up in the Catherine Worland Gallery. This is kind of a little bit of the perspective of the exhibition. My friend Marie Macon, who's an amazing photographer, documented the show, so just wanted to give her some credit. I had a lot of marigolds and also things that I had used for natural dyeing and grown myself. This is the first piece in the show, kind of as soon as you walk in and you make a right. It was right there on the wall. It was the winter weaving, and it's all hand woven with wool as well as some cotton. The wool is hand spun from 1991. I was born in 1995, so I did not spin it, but it was given to me while I was a weaving teacher in Baltimore. So I really love it because it's hand spun, but I also think the yarn is almost as old as I am, so it's kind of fun to use it to weave with. It was a monk's belt pattern, which is all of these little checkers, and also the warp, which are the threads going through the loom, were also striped. So I was working really hard to kind of make a lot of layered work. It also has some raya knots at one end, and it's out of focus in this photo, but the other end has some monk's belt that has pecan dye in it, as well as some pomegranate that I used iron to make it kind of green like trees, was sort of my idea there. The second piece in the year-long weaving work was this spring weaving. I want to say it's cotton as well as raw silk, and I painted the warp as I was weaving it with these different daffodils. Daffodils are one of the first flowers in Maryland, but also one of the first flowers to pop up during spring. So for me, I spend a lot of time outside, foraging for natural dyes ethically or growing them myself. So I always notice what's coming up first. Daffodils are one of those. So this piece was a lot of that. I sort of had this idea that I would leave the stems with some longer threads to really talk about the weaving. To make this, I basically painted the daffodils, and then it's a supplementary weft, which means that as I'm weaving across the loom with the warp, there's another thread that comes in to make the green of the stems. So I also left that thread to kind of talk about that. Oops, I'm going the wrong way. This next piece in the show is a piece that I made before this last year. This piece was made in 2023, and it's titled Puka. Puka is the Hawaiian word for hole or for pocket. So it's a double woven structure, which means that on the loom, I'm weaving two pieces of fabric at once. so I can create these slits. And then in those slits, I stuffed a bunch of natural dye material, like black Hopi sunflower seeds, some coreopsis that I had grown, as well as some marigolds. And I steamed the whole thing and bundle dyed it so that it came out through the pockets, but the actual natural dye material is trapped in the weaving. And then I was sort of making this for a show at the Center for Visual Artists in Greensboro, North Carolina, and I really wanted it to be a square really, really badly. But the exhibition I was doing it for really wanted kind of a larger work, so that's where I got the idea to tie these marigold strands on the bottom of the weaving as the fringe. The marigold strands are, for me, a way that I store a lot of the natural dye material for the whole year because they grow in the summer and then I usually have to save them. And also, I am from Hawaii, so the strands to me talk a lot about lei making and other things like that that are more crafts that I grew up with. Excellent. This is another shot sort of moving into the summer weaving. The summer weaving to me was a collaboration of two different pieces. It was this piece that I had made in 2023 called Leave Me in Vermont. And they are a bunch of different photos that I wove, and then all of the woven photos are then sewn together into what I like to think of as almost a quilt. It does have holes in it. That's because at the time I was a baker, and I really believe as an artist in noticing what you notice and kind of making art based on your daily routines or just things that we do every day. So for me, I was baking, and every morning I would see this sort of tattered curtain in this abandoned house across the street from the bakery. So I really wanted to use those shapes in this piece. So for 2024, I made the nets. They are hand-woven nets out of cotton and linen, and then they're fresh leaf indigo dyed with some indigo I grew myself. So that's kind of the background. And then I hung the Leave Me in Vermont photo weaving in the center, sort of as an all-together weaving about summer. I wanted summer to feel very like ephemeral and light and fun. I also wanted to make a year-long weaving, but I really wanted different weaving structures. So I was like, okay, I can't make one continuous warp, one continuous weaving for the whole year. So that's why they're all sort of different styles. This is just sort of another shot of the net in the back. And then this is sort of how they're all sewn together with this like thread. And they're kind of surgeon stitched. I just really liked the way it looked, but it did take me a really long time to work through all those stitches. Excellent. This piece is the fall weaving. It's also in the back of the room in the Emerging Perspectives exhibition. People always want to know what weavings took me the most amount of time. This weaving took the most amount of time out of all of the weavings in the show because the yarn is hand spun. Also, the yarn is dyed with a plant called bedstraw, which is also known as cleavers, or some people call it sticky weed. But it's basically a weed that grows in a lot of fields with a lot of livestock animals, and they don't eat it because it's poisonous to them. So it kind of grows a little bit invasive, and it's hard to hay your field if you have a lot of bedstraw growing in it. So people are almost always excited for you to come up and dig it up. The roots of that plant create this sort of red clay madder-like color. Bedstraw is considered wild matter in the dyeing world. So this piece was something where I spent all of the fall and until the ground froze digging up this plant to use the dye from the roots to then dye the yarn, to then weave the weaving. So this one definitely took the most amount of time. I'm really into lately leaving spaces in my warp so that I can have the weft drape across the weaving. Drapery is a concept that I use frequently in my work. Fringe as well. I really just don't want anyone to ever question whether the work was hand woven, because that's really important to me. So I don't always have the loom present, so I like to make the work look very woven. Oh my goodness, okay. This was another weaving as part of kind of what I was thinking as like the fall weavings in the show. It's actually a section out of a larger weaving that I made for Co-work Frederick, which is a co-working space here in downtown Frederick. I had woven a tree branch and then put the different photo weavings that I wove into the weaving. And then I took those photo weavings and made them into the Leave Me in Vermont piece. So that's something I'll also do, is sort of make a lot of little bits, show the smaller pieces, and then have them come together into a larger work. Kind of as like weaving, creating community, and weaving itself is a structure where you take multiple single threads and weave them together into a whole cloth. So I think about that a lot too, and kind of making little pieces to make bigger pieces. So I sort of just cut out the branch weaving and had that. It also is hung from little branch handles as well. Excellent. This is sort of the corner of that space in the gallery. The branch weaving is on the right, and then below that is a net that I had made out of sisal twine, and I also dyed it with sandalwood. It was a weaving that I had made at Penland when I first learned how to make nets. So that was kind of the first net that I ever made, and then I made the other nets years later in 2024 for the summer weaving. This next weaving in the lineup is Sticks and Stones. It's a weaving that I made while I was an artist in resident at Vermont Studio Center. I had ethically foraged the raspberry canes, and I really wanted to weave with natural materials that felt place-based and felt like they belonged to the space. So I wove this weaving spaced warp again with the raspberry canes in there. And when I put it on the wall, it was so light that it all kind of scrunched up together. So I was like, I need something to weight the weaving. And historically in weaving, there were two ways that we would weave before we discovered the floor loom and made that invention. We would either put pegs into the ground and then warp and then weave on the ground, or we would take the warp threads, tie them to stones, and throw them over a tree branch or over a barn timber, and then we would go ahead and weave because the tension was weighted by those rocks. So I had a similar idea with this weaving where I was like, I'll just weight them with the rocks. Place-based is really important to me though, and I was raised in Hawaii. So in Hawaii, we believe that spirits and people who have moved on live in rocks. So I take the rocks out of the weaving every single time I install it, and I'll use rocks from the specific place that I'm installing the weaving. So for example, when I made this weaving at Vermont Studio Center, I used rocks from the Gihon River. And then recently when I reinstalled it here for my show Time is a Place, I used rocks from my own Catoctin furnace here in Maryland. So kind of leaving the rocks where they are and really kind of bringing the piece back to place, even though it is in different places. This was a weaving that I had made over the summer that when we walked through the gallery upstairs was sort of on the other side of the room by the loom. That's really because it was so small, but it was a weaving I made during the summer. It is all natural dyed with invasive plants from Vermont. That would be some buckthorn berries, as well as the invasive bedstraw roots, and some jewelweed, which I used for the first time, which I really love. All those plants also grow here in Maryland. And so I natural dyed and then wove this table runner, and then I hosted a meal with my artist in residence, and we all sat down for tea. So it was also, there's a lot of history in natural dye plants not only being used for color, but also being used for medicine, and as we all know, food. So I'm trying to bridge those places with my baking history, and obviously me being a weaver and a natural dyer, to somehow, I think it would be really cool to basically like natural dye with food scraps from a meal that I cooked and then shared with everybody as like a weaving community building based sort of idea. This piece was one of the last pieces in the show. I made this one a while ago on my first residency in 2019. That was also in Vermont. It was my first time going there. And it is naturally dyed with Osage orange sawdust, which is often used with woodworking or people who are making bows. So it's a really good way to ethically use that plant because Osage orange is an exotic wood. So when we're talking about ethically using natural dyes, it's something that we want to think about. It's something that I want to think about. So I did use Osage orange, but it was sawdust that they use from sharpening bows and from whittling bows. So I felt confident with that. It also has the wild madder root in it, and there was an exhausted indigo vat at this residency. So there is a little hint of green at the bottom of the weaving, but not too much because it wasn't an active indigo. I guess I should talk a little more about that. Indigo is alive, a lot like yeast. So indigo is a dye that is very unique in the natural dye world because it's fermented, and then when you dip your fiber in it and you take it out, it oxidizes. So if we imagine the indigo vat is the indigo plant, it usually has a sugar that feeds it, and then it'll have some kind of alkaline, like a lime or something else in it to make that reaction. You let it ferment, and then when it's ready and it has its flower on the top, which is like a little bubble sudsy moment, you go ahead and you dip your fabric in, and when you take your fabric out, it's usually green or yellow. As it oxidizes, as it mixes with oxygen or even with water, it becomes more blue. And that's how we get that indigo color that we all know and that we all love. But it is a different dyeing process than other natural dyes. So that's why this weaving is very faintly green, because the natural dye indigo was exhausted, meaning that the sugar and the alkaline weren't really having a conversation. Either the vat needed more sugar or it needed more alkaline. I just used it. I figured it would be fine. But that's a little bit about indigo. We can get into that if anybody has more questions about indigo. That's a close-up. I often will use recycled yarns from sweaters, or as I said, other hand-spun yarns that people gift me. And then I also love to use these really terrible synthetic sparkle yarns that I get from either Walmart or online at other places. I really love the juxtaposition between a natural fiber and something that's so clearly not natural. So I've been experimenting with that. I also think the sparkle is becoming this interesting through thread throughout all of the work that I make. Excellent. This is the loom, which I had in the exhibition and also is in the back of the room we'll do the weaving demonstration on. Again, this is a spaced warp weaving, which means that the warps are not going singularly through the loom. I do clearly have these gaps in the warp, and that makes it so that the weft thread, as I'm weaving across, can just sort of drape across the loom. So that's another way that I have been weaving some drape. This was the last work in the show. It's huge. I had made it originally for the Arbutus Baltimore Library. So it was this huge 28-foot wall. I really wanted to make something that you could look at far away as well as close up. Because it was in a library, I was thinking about text and textile. They are from the same root word, the Latin root word of texere. And weaving historically has been used as a way to communicate either through iconography or through imagery, different meanings to people throughout history. For a really long time, none of us could read or write. So that was a huge reason why weavings were so prevalent in places like churches and other institutions, because people could not read the stories, but they could look at a tapestry and see the images and understand what was happening. So I also have been thinking a lot about text and textile and weaving words without necessarily using the letters that we all are familiar with. So this piece is about the Itsy Bitsy Spider rhyme, obviously being a weaver at the library, but it's only woven with the spaces of the poem. So rather than weaving every individual word in the pattern of the loom, it has these lino lace spaces in where the Itsy Bitsy Spider poem would have spaces in between the words. So it's very coded, but that was kind of my idea. I've made some other work about text and textile that's a little more obvious and less abstract, but I really love this work, again, with those really sparkly threads and the drapery. Each set is kind of a different part of the poem. Excellent. Well, that's all I have for my time as a place. Yeah, thank you all so much. Does anybody have any questions about the show or about the work or about anything that I said? Awesome, sure.
Where did you learn to weave?
I learned to weave at VCU Arts, where I went to school in Richmond, Virginia. After I graduated VCU, when I went to VCU at the time, it wasn't part of the curriculum to have natural dye. And when I was a college student, it was really a resource issue. Like, I was already spending so much money on silk and cotton and linen, and I couldn't also afford synthetic dyes. And in my program, there were a lot of old school weavers that really believed that to be a weaver, you have to dye your own threads. that to buy threads that were already dyed, you're not really a weaver. Yes. So I started saving all of my food scraps, and the first natural dye weaving I made was with onion skins and avocado skins. And it gave this really beautiful sort of pinky colors for the avocado, which I was excited about. And the onion skins gave this really rich yellow. And I made a weaving with that, and it really spoke to me on a lot of levels, I think because I'm from Hawaii, but also just growing up in a time where I think the climate crisis is something we all think about. So I really loved saving my scraps and getting color from things that I would have just thrown away. So that's where I got into natural dyeing. When I graduated, I did go to Penland School of Craft for 8 weeks, where I did more intense weaving, and I worked with a weaver named Jessica Green, who is no longer with us, but she was really the one who brought me to my practice. She taught me everything I know about natural dyeing. She taught me almost everything I know about ethical foraging. I did read Braiding Sweetgrass, which gave me a lot of beautiful new ideas. But I did a lot of natural dyeing there, and she was a weaver who lived in Sandy Mush, North Carolina on a farm. So she also grew a lot of her own natural dyes and did a lot of foraging in the woods for dyes. So that's really how I got into it. Yeah. Sure.
Could you explain how you did the photo weave?
Oh, absolutely. Let's pop back there. Yeah. The photo weaving is one of my favorites. I basically had made, they are 35 millimeter photo films from those disposable cameras. I love them because they talk a lot about nostalgia, and I love the physicalness of the film, I would say. So I will go ahead and take a bunch of photos from artist residencies or travels I went on. I just have a disposable camera right now that might be ready to develop from my time at John C. Campbell Folk School. And basically, I take one photo, is my warp, and I do think a little bit about the warp and the weft having a conversation. You know, like, can I weave the land and the sky together? Can I weave my friends and the river together? So I think a lot about that. But once I've decided, I will go ahead and take that photo, and I make slits in the photo with a paper cutter. And then when I go to weave that second photo in, I make sure that I only cut one slit at a time. Because if you cut the whole photo, you'll lose your place, and you'll grab a strip that you think is the next strip when really it's not.
So it's 2 photos.
Yes. Each one square is 2 photos, exactly.
No fiber.
No fiber, except for the red thread running throughout.
Wow.
Yeah.
How creative is that?
Yeah, it's been fun. It's been really great because I got into paper weaving, honestly, when I first moved back to Maryland. I was going to school in Richmond, Virginia, and I lived in Greensboro, North Carolina for a little bit being a production weaver. And then when I moved back to Maryland, my mom was like, you can't put your giant floor loom in our living room. That's just not gonna work. So I was like, oh man, how am I gonna weave? So I started to do these photo weavings as a way to just be able to weave small. And I can get my ideas out a lot faster. I know it looks intimidating, but it maybe takes me an hour to make one of these squares, to weave it. The sewing took much longer.
Interesting and unique. I've never seen anything like it.
Thank you. Excellent. Yes.
Could you explain how your spider weaving is the itsy bitsy spider words?
Yes. Basically, I had transcribed the Itsy Bitsy Spider poem, and then these spaces are the spaces in between the words of the poem. So it'd be like, so the itsy bitsy spider climbed up the, and then you keep going throughout. It makes a lot more sense when I have my transcriptions underneath the weaving because it is so coded. But I was really interested in this idea of coding text in a weaving, but also maybe talking about that liminal space between words. It's been an interesting dive because I want to make more work about text and textile, but I don't find myself really to be a writer or to feel like I'm really good with words. I was really scared of words for a long time because in art school, to put words with your visual work is very it feels like the pressure's really on because people are gonna read a lot into whatever that word is or whatever those words are. So for a long time, I was really afraid of it and I just didn't go near it. So this is kind of, I guess, me kind of diving into that in a way that feels accessible to me because I'm talking about the spaces in between the words rather than the words themselves. And it is someone else's work, the Itsy Bitsy Spider. I would love to maybe someday, get into my own writing. We'll see. Yeah. Yes.
I was born and raised in Arizona, so I witnessed the Navajo weaving.
Oh, cool.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Where they raise the sheep.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they shear the sheep, they card it, everything. Have you done that natural?
I have not worked with the Navajo. I'm familiar of their work with the churro sheep, and I've dealt with some churro wool before, but I've never been to that part of the United States yet. I have to go out west, I think. Yeah, absolutely. That'd be exciting. Great. Excellent. Well, perfect. If there are no more questions, I think maybe we'll move over to the loom, and we'll kind of talk about how weaving logistically works, and you all can kind of check out the machine. Okay, so.
Cotton will tilt and then and time.
Yes.
That made me just go.
Thank you. I definitely think of time kind of as a material, right? Because I feel like you could have the loom and you could have all your yarn and you could have it all dyed, but if you don't have time to weave, unfortunately, the weaving doesn't happen. Absolutely. Great. So what we're all looking at is a 4-harness Harrisville floor loom. Harrisville looms are made in Harrisville, New Hampshire, so this is an East Coast loom. One of my favorite looms is the Gilmore loom, which is a West Coast loom, but we can get back into where looms come from later. But essentially, you have your shuttle, which has your bobbin, which has your weft thread. Your weft thread is your thread going across, right, left to right, your weft thread. And then your warp threads are your ones going through your loom, warp drive, right? We're gonna go forward. So essentially the loom works kind of like a piano. You will put your feet on these, what they're called treadles here at the bottom of the loom to correspond with the pattern that you want. So for me right now, I'm weaving pretty simple. We're just doing a plain weave. That means that all of our yarns are going to be lifted up on all of our odd harnesses, our 1s and our 3s, and then all of our even harnesses, our 2s and our 4s. And that's going to create so that the yarns are alternating, and that's how you get that plain woven, just normal weaving fabric. So we'll go ahead and you grab your shuttle, and you all are welcome to stand there, or you can come around, whatever feels good. But basically you just put your shuttle through the loom. We'll grab our beater, which is a little deceptive because we don't ever, unless we're weaving a rug, really want to beat the loom. But we kind of kiss and place our yarns together, and we'll go to the next pattern. Sorry, the loom's a little noisy. But one thread at a time. That's, real life takes time, weaving takes time. It's kind of fun because I think for me, it feels a lot like a collaboration between me and the loom. Like the loom can't be activated without the weaver. And at the same time, I could never make something so detailed and something so efficiently if I wasn't on the floor loom. I think there are a lot of ways to weave, but for me, the floor loom feels the most efficient. So that's the way that I enjoy weaving. Awesome. Are there any questions? Yeah.
Do you ever, do your legs get a good workout from this?
They do. I would say I will stop if my body is telling me to stop. I also, when I was a production weaver in the High Point Furniture Market for 2 years, that was a little tough because I couldn't stop even if I was sore. So I would wear wrist braces because my wrists really started to hurt just from throwing the shuttle, and my ankles really started to hurt from pressing down the treadles. So I would wear braces. But other than that, it was okay. Posture is really important when you weave. It helps. But there is a little bit of, I think, natural hunching that happens because you're looking down at your work. And pressing on the pedals does get tiring. They do make different styles of looms. You could get a lot of rug looms. You'll press down on the pedal and it'll lock in place, because usually you're weaving so wide that you have to throw the shuttle and then run to the other side. You wouldn't be able to just sit at your bench and weave back and forth. So they kind of lock into place. Also, this loom is not set up like that, but in my own home studio, sometimes I'll put the loom on cinder blocks or on a pallet, so it's up higher and I can stand at it. I really love a loom, this is a little chaotic, but I love a loom where it's like my breast beam is right here, and I can kind of just weave up here. But that's a pretty high jump, so usually I just lift the loom up.
Yeah. And another question.
Yeah.
So So like the loom, does it ever need to be repaired? And if it does, like, are you like an expert at like looms, or do you have to set?
Yeah, I think at this, I don't know if I would say I'm an expert, but at this point I feel like I've definitely fixed and taken apart enough looms that you kind of know what you're working with. I think it's a really good idea. It can be really scary, but I think when you get the loom, a lot like a car, if you take the whole thing apart and then put it back together, you learn a lot about your loom, and that can be scary, but I feel like it's helpful. I think all the moving parts of the loom are the parts you have to watch out for. So this beater right here, you want to make sure that you're using sewing machine oil. A lot of the times use the oil of sewing machine. You can use that on the metal parts of your loom that move. Those parts will get rusty and will get stiff over time. The wood itself is treated, so that should be okay. You can use, what's that, Meyer's soap? Is that what it's called? Murphy's, thank you. You can use Murphy's soap, and that does a really great job to bring the natural shine back to the loom and also protect it from weather and things like that. These break pretty often. I want to say these lamb straps break pretty often. You can see this one I tried to repair with my sewing machine. I used a zigzag stitch, but it holds so much tension here on this front beam. These I probably will just have to replace. A lot of weavers, instead of using the straps like a whole apron, which is basically like a singular piece of fabric, like canvas, so that it's not having these little pinch points on the bar. For that, it's a really easy install. You'll just go ahead and staple the piece of fabric to your beam. You'll go ahead and sew a little slit maybe to put your bar in, and then you're good to go. So that's what's kind of nice about looms, is that you do have to take care of them yourself, absolutely. But it makes sense when you look at the loom working. Like anytime that a loom breaks, I can almost always look at it and be like, okay, this part looks weird, or oh, that's not doing what it needs to do. Marlena and I earlier brought the loom here to the gallery, and this front breast beam was not in this, what would you call this? Notch, yes. So I had no idea how to get it back in there. And Marlena suggested that we go ahead and pull this side out and then get it on top of the little like latch, so that then we can stick this part back in and kind of slide it in. So it is a little order of operations. Like sometimes you would be like, oh, I need to keep this bar in here, but then that doesn't make sense. So things can happen, especially when you move the loom. Yeah, excellent. Yeah, good questions.
How much does this weigh?
It's not that heavy. You can lift it if you want. This is a what they consider a convertible style loom, which means that like if we take these beams off, this back can fold up. And it is a fairly light floor loom. That's the convertibleness of it, is that you're supposed to be able to fold it up and move it places you want. I could put wheels on the bottom of it. I don't, but that is also an option.
So do you thread each of these like individually through those metal things?
Yes. Yes, I usually thread front to back, which means I go this way, but you're welcome to thread back to front. It really depends on, honestly, it really depends on how many tools you want to use. You have to use lee sticks, which are these sticks that hold the, this is a lot of weaving things, but you have to use lee sticks that will hold the cross if you're going to come from back to front. Whereas if you go from front to back, as soon as you get your threads through the reed, it'll keep the order of your threads. So that's why I go front to back. But essentially, yes, you have all of your threads on what's called a cross on your hand. And a cross is basically when you warp the looms onto a warping board, because you warp them and measure the yarns so that they're long enough when you go to the loom before you come to the loom to weave. So you do layer them kind of like this in a cross, so that the order you're putting the threads on the warping board is the same order you put them on the loom. So we don't have any tangles, we don't have any crisscrosses. So once you have that cross on your hand, I'll take one thread at a time and go ahead and go through my entire beater. And then once I'm through my beater, this is where the pattern lives, in the harnesses of the loom. So this is where I'll grab my, what they're called heddles, these metal pieces, and they're kind of eyes of needles that I'll put individual threads through depending on what kind of pattern I want. So this is a fairly easy pattern because it's plain weave. It's just 1, 2, 3, 4 over and over and over again. But if I wanted to do something more complicated like a coverlet, it might be anything like 2, 4, 1, 3, and then it might change the next time. So it can get a little confusing. I usually write it out. But after I get through all of my threads through these heddles, then I can tie onto this back beam. I can wind all of my unwoven warps on, and then I'll go ahead and tie to the front, and then I can start weaving. So it can be a little intimidating because if you want to weave something really wide, like if I wanted to weave 36 inches wide, it might be like 1,500 threads. And so then not only have I warped 1,500 threads on my warping board, but now I have to go to the loom and I have to thread 1,500 threads through the beater, and then I have to thread them again through the actual heddles of the loom before I can even start weaving. Yes, absolutely. Yes.
I was wondering, something like this size, just plain weave, being the expert that you are, how long does it take you to work the loom before you get started?
Oh, this took me maybe like 2 hours.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's
Just to get it set up.
That's all.
Yes. Yes. But usually if I go the whole width of the loom, when I was a production weaver, I'd do the whole width of the loom, and we would maybe do about like 10 to 15 yards we would put on the loom. That would take me a full 8-hour day with the warping. So it can take some time, but I think the more you do it, obviously the faster it feels, the faster it becomes. Yes.
Did you move the loom today with this on it, or did you have to restring it when you were raw?
No, I moved this with this on it. This is the same weaving that was on it for the show that I had upstairs, and then the loom got kind of moved around, and I was like, oh my gosh, I really hope when I go to the delaplane it's not ruined. But you can see it's not. It's got a little bit of hay on it from the car, and some of the threads are overlapping, but as long as your threads are not twisting here in the beater or here in your heddles, or when you go to give yourself what's called your shed, which is where you're going to put your weaving to weave back and forth, it'll be okay. So I feel like the tension on this weaving is not ideal. If any of you want to come and feel it, I can feel that these threads that I've doubled in the reed are tighter than these single threads. But I also feel like with a spaced warp, it doesn't matter as much. You know, because if it has some draping in between, that's okay, because that's going to happen naturally because there's no thread to take up any space in those areas. Yes?
Question. I'm just really interested in the process.
Absolutely.
Obviously, you're an expert.
Thank you.
I'm curious about what you find is like the hardest or most complicated part, or even maybe a part that you just, now that you are an expert, like, oh, I'm so glad I know how to do that now. Or is it just like setting it up, or?
Yes, it is setting it up. Yeah. I like to think, I tell my students threading the loom is like the sour before the sweet. Like I feel like you kind of lock into the threading and you sort of like fight your way through that because you know the weaving is so sweet and the weaving is so fun. And the weaving takes time, but the weaving feels fast once you've gotten to that point. I am kind of a tall person. So when I go to thread the loom, it gets a little dicey because basically I will like hold the beater with my, this is not how you should do it, but I hold the beater with my hand. I've got all the threads in this hand and I will just kind of like crouch and like sit here and thread them through. Some weavers like to weave with an office chair because you can get lower, or a step stool, because where you really want to be is kind of in the loom here to make it easy on your back and shoulders so you can just go ahead and thread through. But that's kind of hard for me. I kind of just grit and bear it and I get through it. But definitely the warping is the hardest part. It's not creative. And for me, there are certain choices when you're weaving where you can decide that you're not going to do that. But for the threading, you really have to make choices and you have to do it correctly, because if you don't set up the loom correctly, the weaving won't work. Versus when you're weaving, there's a lot of different things you can do that may not work, or some people would be like, that's not how I weave. But I think when you're doing this part for me feels very like craft and very technical, and like I have a hard time going away from that because I know that the loom won't work. Mm-hmm. But yes, I love the dyeing is really fun. It feels a little passive because I can have a pot on the stove and I can be weaving. I love the weaving, feels really fast, feels really fun. I sat down at a floor loom at VCU and I started weaving and I was like, oh my gosh, I want to do this for the rest of my life. Like, how do I figure out how to do this for the rest of my life, even though it's 2017? So that's kind of where I ended up, and that's sort of why I'm here now, as an expert of somebody with a floor loom that feels like such a traditional piece of equipment. But I also think it's really magical to be able to just take single threads and make cloth. I think the ability to make cloth is a lot like the ability to live a life, the ability to cook, the ability to, I think there are a lot of skills that we have that are life skills, and I think of weaving as a life skill, even if it feels like weaving is not something we do in our day-to-day. I think weaving's all around us. I think textiles are all around us. I think the lessons that weaving has to teach us are all around us, so that's kind of what I'm into. Yeah. Excellent. Yes?
Did you dye this?
I did not dye this, I'm so sorry to say. It's so beautiful, I did not dye it. It is from Gist Yarn, which is an American yarn company. It's women owned, love them. It's raw silk. Yeah. Yeah, I got a gift card for my birthday, so I was like, I'm getting some raw silk, yeah. Excellent. Are there any more questions? Great. Well, thank you all so much for coming to my talk and checking out the loom. Yeah, it was great. Awesome. Yes.
You said something about your students. Do you have a studio or?
You know, I'm not actively teaching right now. I was a member of the Weavers Guild of Greater Baltimore, and I was teaching the weaving school, and then I also was teaching weaving classes at Lovely Yarns, which is an amazing retail yarn shop if any of us are ever in Baltimore. So definitely go check them out. I'm not really weaving anywhere right now, but I just came back to Maryland after being at North Carolina at the folk school for 9 weeks. I was doing a work study, having so much fun, making all new things. So I think now, yeah, I'll kind of try to find my bearings and possibly get back to teaching.
I bet you have a lot of customers.
So true, thank you. Excellent. Well, thank you all so much. I hope you have a great day. Excellent, excellent.